Robert Johnson survived World War II with 28 confirmed kills in his Thunderbolt, returning home as one of the top American aces in Europe. After his final combat mission in May 1944, he landed at Halesworth to find Colonel Hubert Zemke waiting. "Get the hell out of here, Johnson," Zemke said. "You're going home." It was a moment of relief and guilt, relief to survive, guilt to leave friends still fighting, but the road home nearly ended before it began. More than a year earlier, on a June day over the English Channel, he almost didn't make it back at all. It is June 29th, 1943. Three Messerschmitt 109s chew up Lieutenant Ralph Johnson's Thunderbolt with cannon and machine gun fire. The damage forces him to split EOS, a diving half roll that reverses direction out of the 3-to-1 combat and run for England. His crippled fighter limps over the English Channel with one wheel hanging down. Colonel Hubert Zemke takes off to inspect the damage and talks Johnson through the crisis. They try to shake the landing gear loose. It refuses to budge. The controls grow heavier with every passing moment. Zemke gives the order to climb to 10,000 feet and bail out. Johnson rolls the Thunderbolt over his knee and rubber life raft jam against the canopy. For 5 frantic seconds, he fights to free himself. He succeeds, counts to 10, and jerks the ripcord. The parachute opens with a jolt that knocks the wind out of him. He hits the channel and inflates his Mae West life jacket. He frees himself from the tangled parachute lines, inflates the small rubber raft, and crawls in. A British flying boat cannot reach him in the rough water, but 3 civilians in a dory fish him out and transfer him to a rescue launch. Just 2 days later, on July 1st, a flight of Thunderbolts flies a mission to Romilly-sur-Seine in France. Robert Johnson is flying as wingman to his element leader, Jim Carter. Near St. Omer, Johnson spots more than 20 Messerschmitt 109s 5,000 feet below them. Completely unaware of the Thunderbolt's presence, it is a perfect bounce. Johnson calls them into Carter, but Carter refuses to take the flight down. Fuel is too low, he says. They would never make it home after a fight. Johnson pleads to make the attack alone. Carter insists he stay with the flight. As they argue, the German fighters vanish to catch the bombers. The golden opportunity is lost. Johnson is heartbroken. A year later, Carter admits he regrets that decision. On July 6th, Johnson finds himself at Biggin Hill for lectures with the Royal Air Force. He takes the chance to fly a practice dogfight against a Spitfire 9B, the new British fighter. Johnson knows the Spitfire can outclimb and outturn his heavy Thunderbolt. But the Thunderbolt has 2 advantages: raw speed in a dive and a roll rate unmatched by any aircraft in the sky. Johnson uses the roll to his advantage, whipping the big fighter left and right, refusing to let the Spitfire turn inside him. When the British pilot tries to follow, Johnson drops the nose in a howling dive, then hauls back on the stick in a vertical zoom. The Thunderbolt shoots upward, leaving the Spitfire far behind. Before the Spitfire pilot knows what has happened, Johnson is above him, 8 guns pointed straight at his cockpit. 6 weeks pass. The 56th Fighter Group escorts bombers to targets across France and Germany, but the Luftwaffe refuses to come up and fight. On August 17th, that changes. The group flies a ramrod mission to Regensburg, an area known to be savagely defended. Johnson is flying wing for Jerry Johnson. They spot a white Messerschmitt 110 drifting toward the bomber formation, firing rockets. Jerry Johnson dives on it. Robert Johnson stays on his wing, covering him, but never has the opportunity to fire his guns. Jerry's burst tears into the Messerschmitt, and it explodes in a blinding fireball. The real fight comes 2 days later, on August 19th, near Gilsey-Rudgen, when Jerry Johnson and Robert Johnson tangle with a formation of Messerschmitt 109s. Robert Johnson dives after one fighter and opens fire. The Messerschmitt spins into his bullets and explodes. He has his second confirmed kill. The 56th Fighter Group is learning to fight. On October the 10th, Johnson climbed into his Thunderbolt for a withdrawal support mission to Munster. The Germans swarmed up in force, and Johnson found himself in a sky filled with enemy fighters. He destroyed a Messerschmitt 110 in a diving pass, then turned into a second German fighter. Cannon shells from a climbing Focke-Wulf tore through his tail, severing the rudder cable. The Thunderbolt lurched. and Johnson felt the rudder pedal swing uselessly beneath his foot. For a long moment, Johnson considered bailing out over Germany. He started to climb from the cockpit, then stopped himself. He hauled in the slack rudder cable, coiling it against the seat, and discovered he could steer using the trim tabs alone. Two Thunderbolts from the 62nd Squadron, flown by Ralph Johnson and a pilot called Hydro Ginn, escorted him through the North Sea stratus, a dense, low cloud bank that could blind a pilot in minutes. A hole in the clouds opened directly over a runway, and Johnson set the crippled fighter down on trim tabs and brakes alone. He had scored 2 kills that day, bringing his confirmed total to 5. He was now an ace. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. 4 days later, the 56th escorted bombers to Schweinfurt, a target deep inside Germany. The Thunderbolts could only accompany the big friends as far as Aachen and Düren before fuel forced them to turn back. The moment they broke off, the sky darkened with hundreds of German fighters. An estimated 400 enemy planes fell on the 224 bombers that reached the target. 60 fortresses went down that day, more than 600 men killed, wounded, or captured. Johnson was not on the mission, but he saw the crippled survivors stagger home. He remembered a B-17 he had watched die near Rennes, its entire crew bailing out before the bomber fell. At Schweinfurt, there was no such mercy. The 56th had done their job, shooting down 3 German fighters without loss, but the cost to the bomber force was staggering. The men returned to base in silence, the usual banter gone. They had learned the hard way what happened when the escort ran out of gas and the Germans still had fighting to do. On November the 3rd, the 56th flew an escort mission to Wilhelmshaven. The trip to the target was quiet, the bombers unmolested, the German fighters staying low. On the way home, Johnson spotted a lone Messerschmitt 109 slipping just beneath the contrails, working its way toward the fortresses. 2 big rockets hung under its wings, waiting for the moment to strike. Johnson pulled in fast on its tail, closed to 200 yards, and squeezed the trigger. The Messerschmitt exploded, and Johnson flew through the remains. It was his 6th victory. The group was closing in on a milestone. They had promised to reach 100 confirmed kills by Sadie Hawkins Day, November the 6th. On the 5th, they flew a ramrod to Münster and downed 6 more German fighters. George Hall of the 63rd Squadron flamed a Messerschmitt 210 for the group's 100th kill. All of them came home. That night, the pilots celebrated in royal fashion, knowing the next day was a holiday. The 100-kill mark was more than a number. It meant the 56th had proven itself, that the early days of getting cuffed around by the Abbeville boys were behind them. The Avengers, as Johnson's 61st Squadron called themselves, had begun to cut a real swath through the Luftwaffe. Francis Gabreski, Bob Lamb, and Jerry Johnson were emerging as deadly flight leaders. The scoreboard showed 44 German fighters destroyed in 5 major air battles that month alone, against 4 losses, 11-1. Francis Gabreski was now commanding the 61st Squadron, and his aggressive leadership was shaping the unit into a fighting force. Johnson flew as a wingman for Gabreski on several missions, learning the rhythm of combat from a pilot who seemed to have a sixth sense for finding the enemy. The group now operated from a new base at Halesworth, north of Ipswich, a muddy, miserable field that none of them liked. But the flying was what mattered, and the flying was getting better every week. By the end of November, Johnson had 6 confirmed kills and was hungry for more. Early on the morning of December 11th, the 56th Fighter Group climbed out over the North Sea, escorting 600 heavy bombers toward Emden. The weather was brutal, towering clouds and fierce winds, but the formation held. Then, without warning, 2 Thunderbolts of the 61st Squadron drew together in a banking turn. A wing sheared off, metal slammed into fuel tanks, and both fighters exploded in midair. 2 parachutes billowed open, but only pieces of the pilots remained in the shrouds. Johnson, leading his element, pushed the grief aside. Miles below, a twin-engine Messerschmitt 110 was sliding toward the bomber stream. He rolled the Thunderbolt onto its back and dove. The German gunner never saw him coming. Johnson closed to point-blank range and fired, watching the heavy fighter tear apart as it hit the treetops. That was his 7th confirmed kill, and the first of a long day. Across the formation, other pilots found targets. Bob Lamb, flying with the 61st, hammered 3 German fighters into the ground. Don Smith and Paul Conger each claimed a triple that day. The group tally climbed, but the loss of Strand and Kruer haunted the mess hall that night. They had died not from enemy fire, but from a moment of human error in the crowded sky. On New Year's Eve, the 56th flew a ramrod to Curlin Bastard. The flight down was quiet, but as they neared the target, tragedy struck again. Pilot Marangelo, flying on the left of the formation, suddenly rolled over and dove straight down. His oxygen system had failed, and he was unconscious before anyone could react. The Thunderbolt hurtled into the sea and exploded on impact, killing him instantly. Johnson had no time to mourn. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s burst from a cloud bank, barreling toward the bombers. He kicked the throttle forward and slammed into a steep dive, catching the trailing fighter in a rolling scissors. The German tried to turn inside him, but Johnson had learned the Thunderbolt's rhythm. He rolled hard, fired a short burst, and watched the fuselage explode. The second pilot panicked, tried to climb, and Johnson nailed him as he stalled. 2 kills in 60 seconds, his tally reached 10. The return flight was long and cold. Marangello's empty cockpit still echoed in every pilot's mind. The group had scored, but the price was a man dead from simple mechanical failure. Johnson logged his victories without celebration. The war was teaching him that survival depended on luck as much as skill. A few days after the new year, Johnson took a modified Thunderbolt up for a test flight. The engineering officers had fitted it with a new paddle blade propeller, designed to grab more air at high altitude. Johnson was skeptical. He'd heard promises before. At 8,000 feet, he pulled the nose up into a steep climb. The jug responded like nothing he had ever felt. The engine howled. The big plane surged upward as if it had shed 1,000 pounds. He spotted a Spitfire 9B orbiting nearby and decided to push the test further. In a straight climb, the Spitfire had always left him behind. Now he poured on the power and watched the altimeter spin. The British fighter struggled to keep pace. The Thunderbolt walked away from it. Johnson grinned inside his oxygen mask. The Germans had lost their only advantage. The climb would never be theirs again. From that day on, every 56th Thunderbolt carried the paddle blades. Johnson knew that in a merge he could go vertical and leave any enemy fighter clawing for air. The propeller was worth an extra 1,000 horsepower, and in the months ahead it would save his life more than once. February 20th brought a mission to Leipzig. The bombers streamed east in perfect boxes, and the 56th flew close escort. Johnson led a flight of 4, scanning the sky for the black crosses that had been so rare lately, but today the Luftwaffe came. A dozen Messerschmitt 110s slid into view, low and slow, hunting for the stragglers. Johnson dropped his nose and let the Thunderbolt accelerate. With the new propeller, the climb was effortless. He positioned himself above the enemy before they even knew he was there. He picked the first Me-110, closed to 200 yards, and blew the tail section off. Before the wreckage stopped tumbling, he hauled the stick back into a zoom and rolled onto the second. A 2-second burst sent it spinning into the ground. 2 more kills, numbers 14 and 15. The flight reformed and returned to base without a scratch. Johnson felt the rhythm of combat settling in his bones. He was no longer a rookie. He was a hunter who knew when to dive, when to climb, and when to let the enemy make the first mistake. March 6th was the biggest show yet, 1,000 bombers heading for Berlin via the Flak Highway, the deadly corridor of anti-aircraft batteries that marked the route to Berlin, and the 56th was assigned close escort. Over Dummer Lake, the radio erupted. Bandits, 200 plus high. Johnson looked up and saw a black swarm pouring out of the sun. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts stacked in layers, diving for the bombers. The sky turned into a hurricane of tracers, flak, and cannon fire. Johnson stuck to his element, protecting his wingman through the chaos. A Focke-Wulf jumped them from the right, and Johnson rolled into a steep turn, firing a burst that tore the German's wing off. A second fighter tried to dive away, but the Thunderbolt caught him in a vertical chase and hammered him into the ground. 2 kills in a storm of steel, and he never lost his number 2. 2 days later, the group flew again. Johnson was sharper than ever. He used the same rolling attack, slicing inside enemy turns and carving them apart. 2 more fighters fell, bringing his total to 19. The 56th had become the Wolfpack, aggressive, deadly, and dominant. Johnson had survived the worst the Luftwaffe could throw, and he was still climbing. In March of 1944, Johnson led his squadron on an escort mission to Brunswick. The Wolfpack cruised far to the left of the fortress formations, searching for enemy fighters that had avoided battle for weeks. At 27,000 feet, Johnson spotted a massive formation of Focke-Wulf 190s, stacked in 3 layers with top cover above him. He called for help on the radio and turned his 8 Thunderbolts head-on into the German swarm. The German formation scattered as Johnson ripped through them in a head-on pass, his guns blazing. One Focke-Wulf exploded under his fire. He hauled the Thunderbolt around in a rolling scissors, staying inside the turn of a second fighter, and hammered it down in flames. His wingman stayed glued to his tail throughout the engagement. Johnson spotted a third Focke-Wulf darting between clouds below him. He dove after it, waiting for the German to emerge from the cloud bank. When the fighter burst out, Johnson was right on its tail at close range. He squeezed the trigger and the Focke-Wulf disintegrated. He returned to base with 22 confirmed kills, the leading American ace in Europe. 10 days later, on March 25th, the group flew a mission to the Bordeaux area. Major Bud Maharan, who had scored multiple triple victories over Frankfurt, pounced on a Dornier 217 bomber racing over the treetops. He destroyed it with a burst of gunfire, but the tail gunner hit his engine with a stream of shells. Maharan bailed out of his burning Thunderbolt, landed running, and disappeared into the French countryside to evade capture. That same day, Jerry Johnson went down after strafing a German airfield. He set his Thunderbolt on fire, then turned to attack a passing train. The sides of the train dropped away, revealing hidden flak batteries. Johnson bellied in across a field, climbed out of his wrecked fighter, shook hands with a stunned French farmer, and headed south for Spain. The loss of 2 top aces in a single mission hit the group hard. Maharan was last seen sprinting across open fields at full speed, and Jerry Johnson was marching toward the Pyrenees. Johnson now sat alone at the top of the scoreboard, the absences at the mess table impossible to ignore. He had outlasted men who had taught him the craft of survival. On the morning of April 13th, Johnson climbed into his Thunderbolt for a bomber escort to Munich. The group had flown several quiet missions since the losses of late March. Johnson was eager for a fight, and as they neared the target, he spotted several Focke-Wulf 190s slipping through broken clouds below him. He called for his wingman and dove after them. The German fighters split and ran, but Johnson locked onto the tail of one in a low-altitude chase. He fired in short bursts, closing the distance, and the Focke-Wulf exploded against a hillside. He swung around and found a second fighter, using the Thunderbolt's superior roll to stay inside the German's turn. He destroyed it with a long burst at close range. The 2 kills brought his confirmed tally to 25, adding to the victory he had earned on April 9th. He landed at Halesworth that afternoon, still the top ace in Europe, but the cost of the score weighed heavily. The men who had shown him how to fight were gone, and the war was far from over. May 8th, Johnson climbed into his Thunderbolt for what would be his final combat mission. Bombers streamed toward Berlin, and the 56th flew close escort. Over the German countryside, Johnson spotted a lone Messerschmitt 209 slipping through the clouds below him. He rolled the big fighter over and dove, closing the gap with the superior speed of the Thunderbolt. In a short burst of fire, the Messerschmitt exploded in a flash of flame, twisting down in pieces. Johnson pulled up and scanned the sky. A Focke-Wulf 190 tried to turn away, but Johnson cut inside the turn and hammered it with his 850s. The fighter crumpled and fell. With his score now at 27, Johnson headed for home. His final confirmed tally would later be recorded as 28. When he landed at Halesworth, he found generals waiting on the flight line. Colonel Zemke grinned and shook his hand. "Get the hell out of here, Johnson. You're going home." The orders were already cut. Johnson was grounded from further combat, his tour complete. He felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief to survive, guilt to leave his friends still fighting. 3 weeks later, Johnson boarded a transport plane bound for the United States. The journey was a blur of emotions. In New York, his wife Barbara met him at the airfield and they embraced after more than 18 months apart. The city lights, visible after years of blackout, seemed almost unreal to him. In Washington, Johnson was introduced to General Henry Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, and taken to meet President Franklin Roosevelt. The president smiled at him. "You're kind of young to be a major, aren't you, son?" They spoke briefly, and Johnson left with a deep sense of the surreal. A farm boy from Oklahoma, now standing in the Oval Office. Johnson often thought of the friends who did not come home. Jerry Johnson had bellied in and was walking toward Spain. Bud Maharin had bailed out and was evading capture in the French countryside. But many others were gone forever. Johnson knew that his survival was not just skill, it was the work of good mechanics, sharp wingmen, and sheer luck. He carried their memory with him. The 56th Fighter Group would go on to destroy over 1,000 German aircraft by the war's end. The Wolfpack owed much of its success to Zemke's innovative fan formation, a tactic that spread the squadron out like a fan to cover more sky, allowing them to spot and engage German fighters before they could reach the bombers. Francis Gabreski finished the war as the top American ace in Europe with 31 kills, ending his combat career as a prisoner of war after a crash on his final mission. Bob Lamb survived the war, having continued to fly with the 56th. But for Johnson, the number was never the point. What mattered was the brotherhood of pilots who flew into hell together, and the silent faces of those who never returned. He stood on the tarmac at Post Field, Oklahoma, watching the summer sky, remembering the roar of a Thunderbolt's engine and the voices of his friends on the radio. That sound would never leave him. If you have any personal stories, family memories, or historical anecdotes from the air war in Europe, we would love to hear them in the comments below. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support our future documentaries. Thank you for listening and for honoring the courage of those who flew.